sound of fabric tearing cut through the bar like a gunshot. In the middle of Murphy's Tavern, a biker had ripped the shirt off a quiet black woman, only to freeze when her back revealed a tattoo that stopped 30 men cold. But to understand why one image could silence a gang of killers, you have to go back 6 months. The sound of fabric tearing split the room like a blade through silence. For a heartbeat, no one in Murphy's Tavern breathed. The yellow lights glared down on Maya Thompson's back as the cotton of her shirt gave way under Rex Morrison's grip. Smoke from half-burned cigarettes hung in the air, unmoving, as if even the haze itself froze to witness what had just been revealed. A dozen bikers formed a wall of leather and steel around the center of the room, boots grinding against the sticky floorboards, but every eye had locked on the black woman now standing bare under the spotlight. The bar, usually filled with noise, laughter, drunken shouts, the jukebox sputtering its same old 20 songs, was silent as a grave. Rex's knife still gleamed in his hand, though it trembled just slightly enough to betray something foreign on his face. The arrogance he wore like armor faltered, and for the first time fear crept into his eyes. "Holy, what the hell is that?" one of the steel wolves whispered, his voice breaking the hush like glass. The question was half-formed, carried on a nervous exhale, but it echoed louder than any brawl, bouncing off the walls and sinking into every chest in the room. Even the jukebox seemed to hesitate between tracks, caught in the same paralysis as the people. 30 pairs of eyes fixed on the shape sprawled across Maya's skin, the ink that had turned the air thick as tar, the image that no one here had expected to see. Rex blinked once, twice, his jaw working but no words coming out. The sweat on his forehead glistened beneath the lights as if he'd suddenly stepped into a battlefield he didn't understand. He had stripped her shirt with the intent to humiliate, to dominate, but instead he had unleashed something none of them could comprehend. Maya's shoulders squared, not with panic, not with shame, but with a stillness that felt dangerous, a calm that carried weight. The room held its breath with her. Power had shifted, suddenly, invisibly, like a tide turning without warning. Murphy O'Brien, the old bartender with war carved into the lines of his face, stared from behind the counter, his hand trembling around the glass he had been polishing. He knew before the others. He recognized the posture, the silence, the unshaken steadiness of someone forged elsewhere, far away from this suburban tavern. The others only saw a tattoo, but Murphy saw a story. Outside, the summer night pressed heavy against the windows, the world oblivious to the storm that had just erupted inside. Inside, no one moved. Every instinct screamed that something irreversible had just happened. But to understand why one ripped shirt could freeze a room of hardened men, to know why ink on skin could stop the heart of a gang leader mid-breath, we have to go back 6 months, to the night Maya Thompson first walked through these doors, carrying ghosts no one here was ready to face. 6 months earlier, the tavern looked the same as it always did, worn leather stools scarred from decades of elbows and spilled whiskey, wooden tables with initials carved into their surfaces, and a jukebox in the corner that refused to learn new songs. Murphy's Tavern was a place where the past clung stubbornly to the air, where smoke seeped into the walls and time moved slower than anywhere else. It was here on a Tuesday night that Maya Thompson first walked in. She said little, carrying nothing but a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her expression unreadable, her steps measured. Murphy O'Brien, the owner, a man whose silver hair and lined face told stories of a war no one asked him about anymore, hired her on the spot. He didn't ask for a resume, didn't demand references. He looked into her eyes, saw something civilians never could, and simply said, "Start tomorrow." From the very first shift, her habits set her apart. She positioned herself behind the bar with her back always to the wall, never exposed, never careless. Every 30 seconds her gaze swept the room in a rhythm so precise it was like a metronome. First the exits, then the hands of the patrons, then their faces. To most it looked like absent-minded scanning, but to anyone who had ever worn a uniform, it was obvious muscle memory. When she wiped down glasses, her movements were exact, like a soldier cleaning a weapon. Each turn of her wrist deliberate, each pause purposeful. At 5'6", with a slender build and quiet manner, she fooled strangers into thinking she was fragile. They never noticed the way her fingers instinctively found the balance point of every object she touched, or how she leaned ever so slightly away from anyone who came too close, calculating space and distance. For Murphy, who had seen enough soldiers return from jungles and deserts with shadows stitched into their eyes, it was all too familiar. He watched from behind the register, polishing his own glass with a rag older than some of his customers, and later that night he muttered to his wife that girls got ghosts. His wife didn't argue. She'd seen them too, Upstairs, in the tiny room above the tavern that came with the job, Maya lived in silence. The space was small, but for her it was a fortress. 4 walls she could control, 1 door she could lock. Yet even there, the war followed. At exactly 3:17 every morning, her body jerked awake. The smell of burning metal filled her nostrils, her chest heaving with the phantom weight of an M4 pressing against her shoulder. Her right hand would search instinctively for the sling that wasn't there, finding instead the raised tissue of old wounds. The pain was long healed, but the memory stayed sharp. In the dark, she muffled her screams into the pillow, careful not to disturb the quiet of the tavern below, timing her breaths with the passing hum of traffic outside until reality returned. Then she sat on the edge of her bed, eyes fixed on the window until dawn bled into the room. By daylight, she covered herself in long sleeves no matter how hot it got, hiding the stories etched into her skin. Behind the bar, she spoke little, answering customers with nods and gestures. Some mistook it for coldness, but the regulars learned quickly that her silence wasn't distance, it was discipline. When she sliced limes for drinks, the blade flashed in her hand. Not like a bartender's tool, but like a weapon, controlled, efficient. Conversations faltered around her, patrons unconsciously holding their breath, sensing the history behind the calm. Murphy noticed. He saw the way she always sat facing the door, the way her shoulders tightened at sudden noises. One Friday night, when the jukebox skipped and screeched mid-song, she flinched before anyone else, eyes darting to the exits, jaw clenched. It was the reaction of someone who had heard mortars instead of music, explosions instead of static. The townspeople didn't ask. They were used to people arriving with baggage and leaving with debts, but Murphy understood there was a difference between carrying secrets and carrying scars. He let her be, the same way he wished people had let him be after Vietnam. Still, no amount of discipline could erase instinct. Late one evening, distant rumble of Harley-Davidson engines rolled down the street. They were too far to shake the tavern's windows yet, but Maya's hand froze in mid-motion, the cloth she used to dry a glass trembling slightly. Her chest tightened, breath caught in her throat. For a split second, fear surged up her spine, raw and unmasked. She forced her fingers to still, set the glass down carefully, and painted a small, tight smile across her face as if nothing had happened. To anyone watching, it was nothing more than a momentary pause, but Murphy caught it. He saw the tremor in her hand, the effort it took to mask it. He knew that kind of reaction, the way old wounds sometimes screamed louder than fresh ones. He said nothing, simply continued polishing his glass. Maya exhaled slowly, burying the shiver, hiding it under the same armor she wore every day. The jukebox carried on with its tired songs, the laughter of patrons filled the gaps, and life in Murphy's seemed ordinary again. But beneath the surface, the storm had already stirred. Friday nights had a rhythm of their own at Murphy's Tavern. By 8 o'clock, the rumble of Harley-Davidson engines would roll down the street, a sound that made the window panes quiver and conversations stumble mid-sentence. Couples cut their nights short, regulars settled tabs early, and even the most reckless drinkers found excuses to leave. The Steel Wolves Motorcycle Club didn't just arrive, they occupied. Their presence pressed against the walls like smoke too thick to breathe. Inside, Murphy kept an envelope behind the bar, $500 in worn 20s, always ready. He counted it with the care of a man who understood ritual, sliding it across the counter when Rex Morrison swaggered in. Rex, tall and broad with arms inked in violence and scars carved deeper than the tattoos, grinned like he owned the place. In truth, he did, at least on Fridays. Same as always, Murphy muttered, voice low, his hand trembling just enough to betray him. Rex picked up the envelope, flipped through the bills without looking, then tossed it to one of his men. He leaned across the counter, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey, and said, "You're lucky I'm generous, old man." Murphy nodded because that was safer than speaking. Maya watched from behind the bar, eyes sharp but face expressionless. Her fingers tightened on the rag she held, knuckles whitening, but her movements never broke rhythm. She had learned long ago that survival sometimes meant silence. That night, silence was tested. On her way to the dumpster out back, the screams reached her first, sharp, panicked, unmistakably human. She froze, heart hammering, before stepping closer to the alley. There, under the jaundiced glow of a streetlight, Rex had Jimmy Chen on the ground. Jimmy's small electronics shop sat 2 blocks over, a family business that couldn't meet Rex's latest demand. Now Rex's boot was coming down again and again, each kick punctuated by laughter from his crew. Jimmy gasped for air, curling to protect his ribs, but the blows kept coming. A phone camera light blinked coldly in the dark as one of the wolves filmed, The cruelty meant not just for punishment, but for show. Maya's whole body coiled like a spring. Her hand flexed, nails digging into her palm until the skin broke and a bead of blood welled up. Every muscle screamed to intervene. Every instinct drilled into her bones demanded action. She could already see the angles, the movements, how easily she could drop two men before they even realized she'd moved. But she forced her body to stay still. Her whisper broke the night, words spoken only for herself. "Not my fight, not tonight." She turned, each step away heavier than the last, the sound of Jimmy's pain trailing behind her. Inside the tavern again, she bent to pick up a broken bottle someone had left on the floor. As she tilted her head, the collar of her long-sleeved shirt slipped just enough to reveal a jagged scar running along her jawline, a thin pale line against dark skin. It was visible for a second, maybe two, before she pulled her hair forward and covered it again. No one in the tavern noticed, but the scar told a story that silence could not. The jukebox sputtered into another song, a tired track from decades ago, but the music did nothing to soften the weight in the room. Murphy wiped the same glass over and over, his eyes distant, while Maya straightened the bottles behind the bar with hands steadier than her heart. She had seen men beaten before. She had seen worse, much worse. And yet this moment cut deeper because she had walked away. Upstairs, long after the wolves had gone and Jimmy's cries had faded into memory, Maya sat on the edge of her bed staring at her hands. The blood from her clenched fist had dried, a red crescent where her nails had pierced skin. She pressed her palms together, whispering again the words she had clung to in the alley, trying to convince herself they were true. "Not my fight, not tonight." But in the hollow silence of that room, the words sounded less like conviction and more like a sentence. Outside, the streets emptied into darkness, but the echo of motorcycles lingered like thunder long after the storm had passed. The night began like any other Friday, but there was something different in the air, a heaviness that made Murphy's Tavern feel smaller, tighter, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Murphy O'Brien stood behind the bar with the familiar envelope in his hands, $500 counted out in tired bills, but tonight his fingers trembled more than usual. He tried to hide it, polishing the edge of the counter with a rag, but the shake wouldn't leave. Maya noticed. She always noticed. Her eyes swept the room in their quiet rhythm, exits, hands, faces, but even she could taste the difference in the air. It was metallic, sharp, like blood waiting to be spilled. The rumble of engines came sooner and louder than before, the kind of thunder that rolled straight through the chest. Then the door flew open, slamming against the wall with a crack that silenced the jukebox mid-note. 8 bikers poured in, boots heavy, leather jackets gleaming with patches that marked violence more than brotherhood. Rex Morrison entered last, slower than the rest, like a predator savoring its entrance. He was taller than most, broader too, with the swagger of a man who believed the world owed him fear. His eyes scanned the tavern, enjoying the way conversations died, the way patrons suddenly remembered they had other places to be. Murphy placed the envelope on the bar, sliding it forward with the same resignation he had shown every week for 3 years. "That's everything," he said, voice rough. Rex didn't touch the envelope. He pulled out a chair instead, flipped it backward, and straddled it like a throne, resting his arms on the backrest. His men spread through the tavern, knocking over drinks on purpose, laughing too loudly at nothing at all. The noise was performative, the chaos carefully designed to remind everyone of their place. "Agreements change," Rex said finally, his voice carrying across the room, smooth but edged with cruelty. He leaned forward, his grin sharp as broken glass. "Fear doesn't." Murphy's throat tightened. "Rex, we agreed 500. Economy's tough," Rex interrupted, tapping a thick finger against the wood. "My boys need more, 800 starting tonight." The number hit like a blow. Murphy's shoulders sagged, the years visible in the slump of his frame. Behind him, bottles clinked faintly as Maya shifted her stance, the towel in her hands twisting tighter than she realized. The regulars avoided looking at her, eyes glued to the floor to their drinks, anywhere but the storm forming at the center of the bar. For weeks, she had been part of the furniture, quiet, efficient, invisible. Tonight Rex saw her. His gaze slid from Murphy to Maya, lingering too long, taking in her silence, her stillness, the way she didn't flinch when his men jeered. He tilted his head, smirk curling at the corner of his mouth, and for a moment his eyes narrowed as though he were trying to solve a puzzle he didn't yet understand. Murphy noticed too, and his stomach turned cold. Rex was dangerous enough when all he wanted was money, but when his curiosity was piqued, when he found a new toy to break, the danger shifted into something else. "What's your name?" Rex asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the noise. The tavern fell silent again. Maya didn't answer. She kept wiping the counter with slow, deliberate strokes, her face calm, her breathing even. Rex chuckled, low and menacing, and leaned further forward, eyes locked on her. "Don't worry," he said, almost playfully. "We've got time to get acquainted." The words lingered in the stale air, heavier than the smoke and the stench of beer. Murphy's hand closed into a fist beneath the bar, the rag clenched tight. He had prayed for months that the girl would remain invisible, that her ghosts would never be noticed by men like Rex Morrison. But tonight was different. Tonight the predator had seen her, and once Rex saw someone, he never let go. The bar felt colder, though the summer heat pressed against the windows. Something irreversible had shifted. This was no longer just about Murphy's money. For the first time since she had walked into Murphy's tavern, Maya Thompson was no longer a shadow. She had been pulled into the circle, and the storm had found its target. Rex tipped the beer slowly, almost lazily, letting the amber liquid spill across the floorboards until it spread into a sticky puddle at Murphy's feet. He didn't blink, didn't look away, savoring the humiliation as if it were a fine drink. "Clean it up," he ordered, his tone casual but sharp enough to cut. Murphy hesitated, shoulders tight with age and pride, but Rex's stare left no room for refusal. With a grunt, the old man bent forward, knees buckling, reaching for the rag on the ground. The bar watched in silence, every eye fixed on the sight of a veteran brought low in his own tavern. When Murphy's trembling hand reached for the beer, Rex's boot lashed out without warning, catching him square in the face. The crack echoed through the room, followed by a sickening stillness. Murphy stumbled, blood dripping from his split lip, a crimson bead striking the floor with a quiet tee-chick that carried louder than any shout. Rex laughed, a sound without warmth, his voice booming in the silence. "That's what happens when you forget who's in charge." He leaned back, satisfied, the chair beneath him creaking under his weight. His men grinned, feeding on the spectacle. But before Murphy could fall completely, before he could collapse beneath the weight of pain and shame, Maya moved. She stepped out from behind the bar, crossing the floor with a calm so sharp it silenced even the laughter. She placed herself between Rex and Murphy, her small frame blocking the giant of a man without hesitation. For a moment, no one spoke. The jukebox clicked as it searched for the next track but failed, leaving only the sound of blood dripping onto wood and the faint hum of neon. Maya stood tall, towel still in her hand, her eyes fixed on Rex's. There was no fear in them, no flinch, no compromise. Rex tilted his head, confused. He was used to eyes dropping, to people shrinking away, to fear bending spines before fists ever had to. But hers didn't bend. His smirk faltered just slightly before twisting back into arrogance. "You got something to say, sweetheart?" he mocked, leaning forward with false amusement. A long silence stretched, thick as smoke, the kind that made the bar hold its breath, waiting. Then Maya spoke, her voice measured, steady, carrying the weight of something that didn't belong to ordinary bartenders. "That's not how warriors solve problems." The words landed like a hammer in the silence, each syllable heavy, deliberate, undeniable. They didn't come from anger. They came from conviction. Rex blinked once, caught off guard, his grin freezing as if someone had snapped a chain around his throat. Around them, his men shifted uneasily, sensing a shift they couldn't explain. Murphy, still kneeling behind her, lifted his head with wide eyes, hearing something in her tone that stirred memories of his own youth, of jungles and firefights, of soldiers who spoke in that same precise way. The room itself seemed to lean closer, drawn into the gravity of her defiance. Rex rose slowly from his chair, his full height casting a shadow across her. He loomed, towering, trying to smother her with his size and presence. But Maya didn't step back. She didn't even blink. The towel in her hand dangled loosely, yet her stance was rooted, unshakable. For the first time, Rex Morrison felt the edges of something foreign, uncertainty. He snarled, trying to push through it, trying to reassert the dominance that had never been questioned in this place. But the damage was done. In the middle of his own kingdom, surrounded by his men, Rex had been challenged openly, and not by another thug, not by some rival gang leader, by a woman who looked fragile until she spoke, by a woman who stared him down as if she had already measured his weight and found him lacking. The tavern held still. 30 witnesses caught in a moment, suspended between humiliation and revelation. No one knew yet what would come next, but everyone understood one thing: tonight, the balance had shifted. Rex Morrison had been seen for what he was, and Maya Thompson was no longer a shadow behind the bar. She was a warrior standing. The tavern erupted like a powder keg struck by a match. Rex lunged with the brute force of a charging bull, his chair toppling backward and splintering against the floor. Maya sidestepped, her body moving with the fluidity of muscle memory, redirecting his momentum so he crashed into a table that shattered beneath his weight. Bottles fell, glass broke, beer sprayed across the room. The steel wolves surged forward, snarls on their lips, hands drifting toward concealed knives and chains. The quiet bar was gone. In its place stood a battlefield of wood, smoke, and fear. Maya grabbed a broken bottle, holding it not like a drunk in a brawl, but like a soldier wielding a blade, grip firm, stance balanced. "Stay back," she warned, her voice steady, each syllable ringing with authority. The men hesitated. Something in her tone carried the weight of command, a voice trained to cut through chaos. But Rex rose again, his face purple with rage, humiliation dripping off him like sweat. He lunged a second time, and this time he caught her shirt in his fists. Cotton tore with a sound sharp as gunfire. The fabric ripped wide, exposing her back under the harsh tavern lights. For a moment, time fractured. The noise died. Even the jukebox seemed to falter, caught in the gravity of what had been revealed. Etched across her skin was the insignia of Delta Force, the sword piercing 3 lightning bolts. Surrounded by detailed imagery only warriors understood. Beneath it, bold lettering, Sergeant Maya Thompson, Purple Heart, Operation Enduring Freedom 2019 to 2022. At the base, inked dog tags with the words never forgotten. The tattoo was not decoration. It was declaration. Rex's hands dropped, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The room inhaled as one, holding its collective breath. 30 witnesses stared at the truth painted in black and red across her skin, a truth none of them could process in an instant. And then the world split, present and past bleeding together. Kandahar. The explosion hit like a hammer from the earth itself. Their MRAP flipped sideways, metal shrieking, sand and fire filling the air. Maya tasted blood and dust as the vehicle rolled, then slammed still. Screams tore through the ringing in her ears. Specialist Williams clutched the ragged stump where his leg had been, blood pooling fast. "Stay with me, Williams, stay with me," Maya shouted, dragging him toward cover while rounds cracked overhead. Her shoulder burned where shrapnel had torn flesh, but she kept pulling, her hands slick with blood that wasn't only her own. Back in Murphy's Tavern, Maya's breathing changed, shallow and fast. Rex sneered, sensing weakness circling her like a hyena. "Purple Heart, huh? That means you got hurt, means you failed." He grinned wide, cruel. "How many of your squad came home in boxes because you weren't good enough?" The words pierced deeper than any knife. Maya's jaw clenched. Her eyes clouded. The tremor returned to her hands, the one that came when the nightmares won. She was back in the sand, hearing the medevac pilot screaming through the radio, taking fire, unable to land. Too many wounded, not enough time. She had made choices that night, who to carry, who to leave, and those ghosts never left. Rex leaned closer, savoring the flicker of pain in her eyes. "There it is," he taunted. "The crazy, you going to cry now, soldier? You going to run again?" But Maya didn't run, she stood straighter. The shaking stopped, replaced by a stillness older than fear. Her voice, when it came, was low but carried to every corner of the bar. "You know nothing about sacrifice, nothing about carrying lives in your hands, about making impossible choices when bullets rain down." Her words cut through the smoke, heavier than the broken glass littering the floor. Rex blinked, unsettled by the calm in her tone. The room shifted with her. The witnesses weren't looking at Rex anymore. They were looking at Maya, and in their eyes something changed. Tommy Bulldog Martinez, Rex's right hand, froze where he stood. 2 tours in Iraq had burned their own scars into him. His gaze locked on her tattoo, the unmistakable insignia he had seen only on the most elite operators. His face drained of color. "Holy shit," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She's Delta." The words rippled through the tavern like electricity. Conversations that had died now sparked back, whispers flying from one patron to another. "Delta Force, she's Delta." To civilians, the name carried the weight of legend. To soldiers, it meant something even more. Missions that would never be written about, victories that would never be sung. Warriors forged in secrecy, bearing burdens the world would never understand. Rex faltered, his grip on power slipping as confusion flickered across his face. He tried to smirk, to mock, to smother his fear with cruelty. "Oh, this is rich," he said, but his voice cracked on the last word. "Murphy's got himself a broken toy soldier." He circled her, desperate to reclaim control. "Purple Heart, huh? That's just proof you failed, proof you weren't strong enough." But no one laughed, not even his men. Tommy's hands shifted, his stance no longer one of allegiance. The room was no longer Rex's. The tattoo had rewritten the story, turned the predator into prey. And every witness felt the balance tilt. Maya didn't flinch. She lifted her chin, her scar catching the light. This tattoo, she said, her voice carrying the weight of deserts and coffins draped in flags, means I went to hell and came back. It means I bled for a country that forgets its soldiers until it needs them again. It means I'm still standing. The tavern, once filled with fear, now pulsed with awe. A warrior had stepped out of the shadows, and the storm had only just begun. Rex hit the floor hard. The air blasted from his lungs in a single guttural sound. Before he could recover, Maya moved with precision born of repetition, not rage. Her knee pressed into his spine, her weight perfectly balanced to keep him pinned without breaking him. One arm locked his wrist in a control hold, the kind meant to end a fight without ending a life. The knife he had drawn glinted inches away, but she twisted his wrist just enough to make the blade slip free. It clattered across the floor, spinning to rest under a broken chair leg. The room held its breath. No one had ever seen Rex Morrison downed, not here, not anywhere. His reputation was built on brutality, on the myth that he could not be challenged. And now he lay face first on the floorboards, cursing and thrashing, held in place by a woman half his size. I don't want to hurt anyone, Maya said, her voice calm, steady, carrying like command on a battlefield. But I will protect those I care about. The words sliced through the haze of fear, turning it into something sharper. For a long moment no one moved. Then from the back corner the Marine veteran stood. His hair was gray, his body worn, but his voice cut clean. You're talking to a goddamn hero, he said, pointing at Maya, his words heavy with the authority of someone who knew the truth when he saw it. Heads turned. The weight in the room shifted again. A woman near the bar, apron still tied around her waist, clutched a photograph of her brother stationed overseas. Her voice shook, but she forced it out. She served our country while you were poisoning it. She's worth 10 of you, Rex. Murmurs rose, a low tide swelling. One by one people found their voices. We saw what you did to Jimmy Chen. You've bled this town dry. Enough. The fear that had shackled them cracked, replaced by the raw sound of collective anger, of courage long buried. Tommy Bulldog Martinez stood nearest, his eyes locked on the insignia inked across Maya's back, on the steadiness of her grip. 2 tours in Iraq haunted him still, but in this moment something inside shifted. He stepped forward, past Rex's flailing boots, and kicked the fallen knife further away. The metal scraped across the floor, harmless now. His voice was quiet but final. Stay down, Rex, you've lost. Silence followed, thick and heavy, broken only by Rex's muffled curses. His own lieutenant had turned on him. The other wolves exchanged uneasy glances, the certainty in their leader crumbling as quickly as his pride. Loyalty built on fear is brittle, and tonight it snapped. 2 of the younger bikers stepped back, their hands raised slightly, showing they wanted no part of what came next. They weren't here for war, not against someone like her. Maya kept Rex restrained, her body taut with control. She could have finished it. One twist, one strike, and he would be broken. But she didn't. That restraint spoke louder than violence. It told the room she wasn't here to destroy, she was here to protect. Murphy, blood still dripping from his lip, pushed himself to his feet. His voice was stronger than it had been in years. This is our bar, he said firmly, and she's one of us. The words ignited something. Patrons rose from their seats, forming a loose wall behind Maya. Not fighters, not warriors, but people who had found their courage in her defiance. 30 hearts beating in unison, no longer cowering. Rex thrashed again, but the power had drained from him. He wasn't the wolf now. He was a man pinned to the ground, exposed in front of the very people he once ruled through fear. The wolves looked at each other, unsure, their confidence unraveling as the tide turned. For years, they had walked into Murphy's tavern like it was theirs. Tonight, the tavern belonged to someone else. Tonight, it belonged to everyone who refused to bow. And in that moment, the myth of Rex Morrison shattered, not under fists or knives, but under the weight of unity. Months had passed since the night Rex Morrison hit the floor of Murphy's tavern, and the myth of his power shattered. The tavern no longer smelled only of beer and stale smoke. It smelled of coffee, of fresh paint, of new beginnings. What had once been a hiding place for broken warriors and tired locals had transformed into something else entirely. A wall of honor now stretched across the far side, photographs of veterans young and old. Names scrawled on handwritten notes pinned with pride. Every Thursday, chairs were pulled into a circle, and Maya Thompson stood at the center, not as a bartender, not as a shadow, but as a leader. She spoke to men and women who bore scars both visible and hidden, guiding conversations through the dark terrain of memory and pain. Some nights they cried. Some nights they sat in silence. Other nights they laughed in ways they hadn't in years. And through it all, Maya reminded them of the truth she had learned the hardest way possible, that scars were not signs of weakness, but proof of survival. News traveled fast in the age of screens and clicks. The video of Rex's defeat spread across social media, shared by veterans groups, women's organizations, civil rights advocates. Headlines followed. Female Delta Force veteran stands up to biker gang. Survivor turns bar into safe haven. Camera crews soon appeared, their lenses capturing Maya not in battle, but in quiet moments, pouring coffee for a trembling veteran, guiding a widow through her grief, standing beside Murphy as he rebuilt what fear had nearly destroyed. The story reached farther than Murphy's small town. Within weeks, donations poured in from across the country. Veterans organizations offered support. Universities invited her to speak. She declined most at first, preferring the steady work inside the tavern. But the calls kept coming. And then one day, a young woman walked through the door and froze in the entryway, eyes darting to exits, counting faces. Her hands trembled, her breath shallow. Maya recognized the signs immediately. She set down the glass she was polishing and stepped forward. "I'm Jessica Chen," the young woman said, her voice barely carrying. "Army medic, Syria, 2 months back." The words tumbled out, fragments of pain stitched together by exhaustion. She spoke of the ambush, of the men she couldn't save, of the nights she couldn't close her eyes without seeing them. Tears shimmered, her composure crumbling. "I saw your story online," she whispered. "My mom sent me the article. I sat outside in my car for an hour before I got the courage to come in." Maya guided her to a corner booth, sliding into the seat across from her. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing the shrapnel scars etched along her forearm. "6 months ago, I was hiding from my own shadow," she said softly. "I thought scars meant I was broken, but they don't. They mean we're still here. They mean we survived." Jessica's shoulders sagged, the weight of isolation easing just a little. Murphy appeared with 2 cups of coffee, setting them down without a word, his nod carrying more understanding than a speech ever could. For Jessica, that moment was salvation, and for Maya, it was proof that sharing the darkest corners of her story could light the way for someone else. Word of mouth spread faster than any article. Soon, Murphy's Tavern was filled with veterans who drove hours just to sit in the circle, to hear Maya speak, to find the courage to share their own truths. Families came too, desperate to understand the silence at their dinner tables, the distant looks in their loved ones' eyes. Slowly, a movement began to take shape. Weekly support groups became monthly job fairs. Local therapists offered free counseling nights. Even a congresswoman visited, listening intently as Maya described the gap between veterans and the help they needed. The spark lit in that bar spread outward, city by city, state by state. 12 other taverns across the country adopted the model, creating safe spaces where veterans no longer had to pretend. And then came the invitation Maya could not ignore, a call from Washington, a hearing before the Armed Services Committee. Murphy and Jessica flew with her, joined by Tommy Martinez, who had traded his biker patch for a mechanic's shop where he only hired veterans. They sat behind her as she faced rows of polished desks and skeptical lawmakers. Cameras rolled, the nation watched. Maya adjusted the microphone, her tattoo visible beneath the sleeve of her blazer. Her voice was steady, her words deliberate. "Every day, 22 veterans take their own lives, not because they are weak, but because they are fighting alone. We don't need perfect soldiers. We need honest scars." The room fell silent. Even the committee, hardened by years of testimony, leaned closer. She spoke of Murphy's, of the lives reclaimed in its walls, of the need to replicate that model everywhere. Not another study, not another statistic. Action, connection, courage. The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was reverent. Her proposal passed unanimously. Back home, the tavern was crowded the night she returned. Jessica greeted her with a smile brighter than Maya had ever seen. Murphy raised a glass, his voice hoarse but proud. "To Maya Thompson, who showed us strength isn't hiding scars, it's sharing them." The room echoed the toast, glasses raised high, tears glistened, not from sadness but from release. Words painted themselves on every heart present. No one fights alone. The story could have ended there, with applause, with headlines, with programs funded and policies changed. But Maya knew better. Wars didn't end with signatures or speeches. They ended with people choosing one by one to keep living, to keep helping, to keep showing up. Weeks later, as she stood behind the bar on a quiet Thursday night, her phone buzzed. A number she didn't know. A voice on the line, shaking. Desperate, a veteran on the edge. Maya answered without hesitation. "This is Maya. You're not alone. Let's talk." And just like that, the cycle continued. One scar becoming a story. One story becoming a beacon. One beacon becoming a movement. From a torn shirt on a summer night to the halls of Congress, from shame hidden in long sleeves to hope etched into ink, Maya Thompson had proven a simple truth. The most powerful revolutions don't begin with armies or governments. They begin with someone refusing to hide. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.